It's Huluween on Disney Plus. Watch frightful family favorites like Hocus Pocus and Tim Burton's The Nightmare Before Christmas on Disney Plus.
I am the Pumpkin King!
Then take the terror to 10 with a thrilling new remake of The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, Scream, and more with Huluween on Disney Plus. All these and more streaming this Halloween season with Hulu on Disney Plus. Bundle subscription required. 18 plus. Select Hulu content via Disney Plus. Additional content on Hulu app. Terms apply. Visit disneyplus.com/Hulu for details.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
Говорит Москва.
If you can hear me, take an encryption button off the trial.
Hello, True Spies listeners. Welcome back to True Spies Debrief. Here on the Debrief, we catch up with experts from the intelligence and espionage community for a deeper look at the themes, events, and insights that fascinate them, taking you behind some of the world's most consequential, dangerous, and outlandish missions. Wired journalist Andy Greenberg has spent years reporting from the murky world of hackers, spies, and cyber warriors. His 2019 book Sandworm tells the true story of the Kremlin-backed cybercriminals that became one of the most destructive hacking groups in history. This week, True Spies producer Morgan Childs sits down with Andy to talk about the Sandworm Group and what their campaigns reveal about the future of warfare itself.
Andy, thank you for being here to talk largely, although not entirely, about your book Sandworm, which is stomach-turning, if you'll permit the compliment.
Is that a compliment? I'll take it, if so.
It's I would use it as one in this case. No, it's stomach-turning because it came out in 2019 and it foreshadowed some of the most frightening stories that are still unfolding today. And also because it's kind of a series of snapshots of a time when countries like the United States could have set a precedent for responding to cyber warfare, but largely did not. I guess before we get into that, I want to go back even further than 2019 to 2017 and ask you to talk a little bit about a cover story that you wrote for the July issue of Wired that year. And maybe to talk about the sort of unfortunate synchronicity of events that happened just when that piece came out.
Well, yeah, exactly. That is the beginning of the story for me, or it was as I, began to work on that piece that would be the genesis of this book. So in 2016, late in 2016, my editors at Wired asked me to find the big story of cyber war. And I think what they were thinking about, of course, in 2016 was the Russian hacking and interference in the 2016 U.S. presidential election that was on everybody's mind. But I didn't see that as cyber war at all. I mean, that to me seemed like kind of just dirty politics done by digital means. And I wasn't even sure if I believed that cyber war was a real phenomenon. Like this idea of a kind of military use of cyber power to target critical infrastructure inside an adversary's borders. I wasn't sure I'd ever seen that before, but I had heard about, I'd actually read my colleague Kim Zetter's piece about a Russian cyber attack that had caused a blackout in Ukraine in December of 2015. And that to me seemed like an actual act of cyber war, like a quintessential sort of attack on civilian critical infrastructure. And it was the only one of its kind we'd ever seen. There'd never been a blackout caused by hackers other than that one incident. And so I started looking more closely at Ukraine. And just as I did, a second attack hit the power grid in Ukraine again in December of 2016, this time targeting the capital of Kyiv. So then I sort of knew that there was something unfolding there. And I started making reporting trips to Ukraine to investigate, really. And I started talking to Ukrainian cybersecurity incident responders and government agencies and victims of these attacks, too, to try to actually find out exactly what had happened. And I began to learn that there were, in fact, wave after wave of cyber attacks hitting every strata of Ukrainian society, the media, banks, government agencies. The 2014 election in Ukraine had been hacked in a way that has never happened in the US. Russian hackers tried to spoof the results of the Ukrainian election. So I could see that really there was this ultimately like a kind of scorched earth digital form of warfare happening in Ukraine that was targeting all parts of Ukrainian society, making no distinction between military and civilian targets. And that there had been, in fact, 2 blackout attacks on the Ukrainian power grid of a kind we'd never seen anywhere else in the world. So I wrote this story for Wired about this notion that Ukraine was being used as a test lab for Russian cyber warfare techniques, and that we could look to Ukraine to see the future of cyber war, but also that we should be aware that those attacks would not stay constrained within Ukraine's borders, that sooner or later they would hit us in the West as well. That was the message of that cover story. When you publish a big story like that and making that kind of prediction, you don't actually want it to come true, immediately, or maybe ever, but, certainly not the week that you publish it, which is weirdly what happened. When that cover story came out and was, hitting subscribers' mailboxes, that same week is when NotPetya, this incredibly virulent piece of malicious code, was released by Russian hackers in Ukraine and spread to the rest of the world and ultimately did $10 billion in damage, the worst cyber attack we've ever seen before or since. Yeah. And all of it, I should say, I would learn could be traced back to a single group of Russian hackers working for, if I can kind of spoil the ending here, because a lot of the book is about trying to trace the identity of this group, working for Russia's military intelligence agency, the GRU, this one group of Russian hackers known as Sandworm, because of, they were named that by the US cybersecurity industry because of hints of references to the science fiction novel Dune in their code.
Let's stay with NotPetya for a little bit and talk about, because I think it does have tentacles in so many parts of the world, and parts of the world also that could set a different standard with cybersecurity, right, but seem not to have chosen to do so. So can you tell me a little bit about how it affected the US, Europe, etc.?
Yeah, well, I think you're exactly right that, NotPetya is not like a household name. It's not a cyber attack people have heard of, despite the fact that it is the most destructive, the costliest cyber attack in history. And that's in part because it was, very largely swept under the rug by victims of the attack, by government agencies. I'm still kind of baffled that people don't know more about NotPetya, and not just because I wrote a book about it and talk about it all the time. So NotPetya was this self-spreading piece of destructive code. It looked like ransomware initially. It was designed to pretend to be ransomware, but actually it just spread from machine to machine instantaneously and destroyed everything on the computer. It posted a ransom demand, but you couldn't actually get your data back even if you paid the ransom. And it used a supply chain attack, is what we call it in the cybersecurity industry. It basically piggybacked on this Ukrainian accounting software. Sandworm hacked the company that ran that software and then pushed out a software update through that accounting software called Medoc. And this was a piece of software that was really almost, required to file taxes in Ukraine or even to do business in the country. So if you file taxes in Ukraine or even, traded with a Ukrainian company or had an office there, you very likely had Medoc installed. And so therefore you immediately had a foothold for this malware, which then spread through a combination of a leaked NSA hacking tool and another piece of open source, hacking software called Mimikatz. So all of this together made NotPetya into one of the fastest spreading pieces of malicious code the world had ever seen. It would truly just kind of saturate a victim's network, destroying thousands of computers within minutes. And immediately hundreds and hundreds of victims across Ukraine. Really, the entire Ukrainian internet was just carpet bombed. Dozens of banks, hospitals, every government agency were just completely wiped by NotPetya, a kind of, digital national crisis from a cyber attack like we'd never seen before in history. But then digital worms don't respect national borders. So immediately NotPetya began to spread to the rest of the world, and it hit, Maersk, the world's largest shipping firm, and Mondelez, which owns Cadbury and Nabisco, and ultimately even spread to dozens of hospitals across the United States. It's remarkable that people don't talk about this more, but NotPetya knocked out medical records in American hospitals. I talked to IT administrators in these hospitals who were racing to try to find the raw data that had been lost in patients' medical records, including children, to know if they were able to be transferred for a surgery. I mean, life-saving procedures were delayed and in some cases perhaps, disrupted by this massive cyber attack that truly spread around the world.
Yeah, so I want to ask you about the sort of response and what happened as a result of that.
Well, for a long time, nothing. That was the baffling thing about it. None of these victims of these attacks, and many single companies had lost, as much as $1 billion to NotPetya. And yet none of them wanted to point the finger at Russia or to even talk about this attack at all. I mean, I really banged my head against the wall and went nuts for like a year trying to get anybody to tell the story of this attack. Ultimately, I kind of got it from, some anonymous sources inside of Maersk, who were able to really tell me the experience of watching every computer in that company, the world's largest shipping firm, be completely destroyed in minutes, and what it was like to try to manage massive shipping containers when nobody knew where they were or what was on them, and trucks were lining up outside of 17 Maersk ports around the world, unable to pick up or drop off cargo. I mean, lines that extended miles long. The level of chaos was just unfathomable. And yet Maersk did not want to talk about this, and neither did any of the other victims. And it took, in fact, 8 months for the US government to even call out Russia and say that it was Russia that had done this. 8 months from the biggest and most destructive cyber attack in history for, at that time, the Trump administration to just say anything about it. And ultimately 9 months before they would impose any sort of sanction or try to hold Russia accountable.
Am I right that that was when the White House issued just a 4-sentence statement, sort of acknowledging what had happened, but sort of saying no more?
Yes, but even more remarkably, and this is not just a criticism of the Trump administration, there had been no response to any of Sandworm's attacks on Ukraine, for instance, including like the first ever blackouts caused by hackers. You would think that would be a moment when the United States government, including the Obama administration, which ought to have overseen the first response in 2015, would just say publicly, this is not okay. State-sponsored hackers should not be turning off the lights affecting civilians. They should not be attacking civilian critical infrastructure. And yet there was absolutely nothing said by anyone in the West. Ukraine was absolutely just left to defend itself on its own, treated as a part of like Russia's sphere of influence. I think that is in some ways the most appalling part of this story, and something that I really focused on throughout the telling of this is how the West abandoned Ukraine in the midst of this first ever cyber war, and really just gave Russia a kind of tacit go-ahead to escalate its cyber warfare.
I want to talk about the geopolitics of it all shortly, but you mentioned Maersk and their unwillingness to speak on this. And you've also said that something unique to Ukrainians is their willingness to speak totally openly about the experience of being humiliated in a cyber attack. And I'm curious about that characterization and wonder if you feel as if the opposite, as if a kind of like lack of humility might stand in the way of preparedness, at least on a corporate level, for this sort of attack.
Well, yes. It was interesting trying to report out the effects of NotPetya that companies, I think, were afraid of a kind of victim-blaming mentality that often does affect, cybersecurity reporting. We talk about the Change Healthcare ransomware attack or the Equifax breach or whatever. These historic breaches, we name them after the victims, which is kind of unfortunate. And I think that Maersk wanted to be sure that this was not going to be called like the Maersk breach or something. And so they just completely shut up and suffered in silence. Whereas Ukraine really, in my experience reporting there, wanted the world to understand what was happening, needed help, and understood that. And so Ukrainian victims and the Ukrainian government were, I felt like, just trying to shake anybody by the lapels who would listen and tell them, like, look what is happening here. Pay attention. We are facing something that is unprecedented in history, and we need help. And so it was this incredible experience as a reporter to go there and hear people's stories firsthand of what it was like to face these kinds of cyber attacks. I talked to the guy in the Ukrainian electric utility who watched his mouse movements be taken over by Sandworm's hackers and watched as his own mouse cursor clicked through circuit breakers and turned off the power to 250,000 Ukrainian civilians and could do nothing to stop it. And in fact, he recorded the video on his iPhone and just shared it with me by airdrop without hesitation. I mean, that's a kind of incredible transparency that you just cannot find generally anywhere else in the world. And I'm very grateful to the honestly very brave Ukrainians who were willing to share those stories.
How does the nature of cyber attacks change from country to country? I know you've written a great deal about China's cyber espionage, but am I correct that the kind of large-scale attacks on civilian critical infrastructure that are carried out by Russia are not really something that China, for example, has been so engaged in?
Well, it's really an interesting and a really important question. Countries do have these different kind of focuses and personalities in their cyber attacks. Russia has carried out the most aggressive and disruptive and kind of chaotic acts of cyber warfare. North Korea is a huge problem in that they have essentially state-sponsored cyber crime, where they steal billions and billions of dollars from private companies to fund the government, including its nuclear development. China is a really interesting case, and maybe the most important of all, because for decades China has focused on cyber espionage, including theft of commercial secrets, perhaps as its biggest priority of its state-sponsored hackers. But I have been watching one Chinese group in recent years called Volt Typhoon that is particularly troubling because they're not focused on espionage. They seem kind of analogous to Sandworm, but maybe smarter. They seem to be, in fact, pre-positioning is the word the cybersecurity industry uses, to be ready to carry out Sandworm-like attacks on critical infrastructure, including across the United States, including in U.S. critical infrastructure facilities, power and water. And the theory that I keep hearing from the people who track this group is that they may be preparing for the invasion of Taiwan, the Chinese invasion of Taiwan, and that cyber attacks might be part of an effort to delay a U.S. response to that invasion. So, it's in some ways like I'm seeing like the initial signs of history repeating itself in a really troubling way. But perhaps in just the first week of China's invasion of Taiwan, whenever that may come, and it seems like kind of an inevitability, we might see catastrophic cyber attacks used in the U.S. just to disrupt and delay our ability to help Taiwan and to defend against that attack.
We should clarify that Volt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon, because Salt Typhoon is in the news today, and that may be a more familiar name maybe to some listeners than Volt Typhoon, but these are working in different ways.
Right. I mean, Salt Typhoon, it has been a huge topic of conversation because this is a Chinese cyber espionage group that broke into basically every U.S. phone company, that accessed phone calls and text messages, sometimes in real time. I mean, an incredible breach of Americans' privacy, like an absolutely ridiculous level of surveillance that China achieved. But it's still just spying, And spying, to me, is, of course, dangerous and important, but it's not cyber war, which is the thing that, I don't know, I've found myself focusing on for years now. It's not the threat of disruption of the layers of our technology that make our society work, which is the scariest thing to me.
I'd like to fast forward a little bit and have you talk about this. Is sort of one of the reasons that we have you here is that Sandworm was recently re-released in the UK and Australia with a slightly different title, right? It's now known as Operation Sandworm. I have to think that reissuing it would be somewhat daunting for you, given how much has happened in the intervening years, especially the escalation of the war in Ukraine into a full-scale invasion. Has the world of Russian state-sponsored hacking changed drastically since the book was released?
I think there's no question that the reason that the book was reissued, especially in Britain, where the war in Ukraine feels closer to home, is because of the world's renewed attention to Ukraine. In fact, I feel like a lot of the story of Sandworm initially is how much the world ignored Ukraine's plight. And that changed in 2022. But, I think also I did have to try in a new foreword for the book even to capture the complex story of the role of cyber war in the midst of this full-scale war in which bombs are falling and civilians are being massacred in towns like Bucha by Russian war criminals and children are being deported by the tens of thousands. It was very tricky, not just to try to capture all the events of several years since the book came out, but also to try to reconcile to what degree does hacking matter? Does cyber war matter in the context of a brutal physical war?
So what role has hacking played in the full-scale war in Ukraine since it began in 2022?
Well, it's been really interesting. When the full-scale invasion happened in 2022, a lot of people turned to me like, hey, Andy, where is this cyber blitzkrieg, like this massive cyber war that you predicted would happen alongside this invasion? And I kind of was a bit confused because I never really predicted anything about what would happen in Ukraine. I mean, I was just documenting a cyber war that had already been unfolding for years. And I do think in some ways the cyber war that continued in Ukraine after 2022 was less considered and less visible, but that's only kind of makes sense because bombs were falling. That if you wanted to turn off the power in Ukraine in the midst of an actual physical war, you don't need clever, devious hacking tricks and malicious code. You can just drop a bomb on the grid, which is what we saw Russia do again and again, starting in the winter of 2022. So in some ways, cyber war became less important. I think that the headlines rightfully focused on the physical toll and the actual terrible death toll of this war, and the brutal fighting and on the civilian population. But nonetheless, the cyber war did continue in Ukraine, and in some ways, if it were abstracted from the physical war that people were focused on, if we could see it in isolation, I think we would realize that 2022 to 2023, that part of Russia's cyber war in Ukraine in some ways was the most active of all. In the first year after the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, we saw more data-destroying malware deployed in the country by Russia than we've ever seen hit any country anywhere in the world in the history of computers. And in fact, there were more attacks on the Ukrainian power grid, including one that in 2022 hit a Ukrainian city in the midst of a missile strike, in the midst of an air raid, to kind of do this hybrid attack designed, it seemed, to sow another layer of confusion in the response to that volley of missiles. I mean, a really terrible and callous move of trying to make it even harder for Ukrainian civilians to protect themselves in the midst of, bombs falling.
It's a really interesting part of the book when you're writing about Ukraine's resilience and their use of sort of analog technology and infrastructure to keep going and bounce back. And I was curious, reading it, to what degree you have identified what resilience would look like in the West, or in the US in particular, given our increasing reliance on highly developed technologies.
Right. I mean, now it's almost become a cliche to associate Ukraine with this idea of resilience. We all kind of look to Ukraine as this example of incredible resilience in the face of this absolutely brutal and tragic war that's been inflicted on them by Putin. But as I was writing this book, I could see in Ukraine also, just in a more literal sense, that Ukraine actually was very resilient against these attacks. When the first blackout hit the Ukrainian grid in December of 2015, because Ukraine, has a relatively analog system still, an older system, this kind of post-Soviet grid, they were able to send people out in trucks to just turn the power back on at the distribution stations that were hit by this attack. Whereas, the US grid is quite automated and may not have always that kind of analog fallback. When the Ukrainian Postal Service was completely devastated by NotPetya, they were able to fall back to paper records to figure out who, newspaper subscriptions, and even to figure out who was owed their pensions. That's also a part of the Ukrainian Postal Service that's really important for Ukrainian citizens. They could fall back to paper. I don't think that our American systems, or much of the West, has paper records that we can fall back to in that sense. And so that, I think, became a lesson for how to prepare for these kind of catastrophic cyber attacks that we've seen not just from state-sponsored hackers now, but also, I think, much more often from ransomware cyber criminals who seek to encrypt or disrupt victims' networks and hold them at risk to make them pay a ransom. I think, it's a lesson that you need to prepare for that worst case scenario. Maybe you don't in the West. I don't know if I'm suggesting that we maintain kind of analog fallback or some kind of archaic paper record system, but you do need to be prepared to rebuild your network or to recover from backups. And often, the lesson in one case, when Merck was hit by NotPetya, they had fully backed up their network to what's known as a hot backup, like a connected, networked backup where that was constantly being refreshed in real time. But because it was connected to their traditional network, it too was wiped by NotPetya. So the lesson there was that they needed a cold backup. You need a kind of fallback scenario, something that you can rebuild your entire network from in that worst case scenario. And I think that is a lesson that Western companies have had to learn, both due to state-sponsored hacking, but much more often from the epidemic of ransomware that has hit us in this country too.
How does the threat of Russia's state-backed espionage compare with the specter of independent for-profit entities who might be infecting us with ransomware?
Well, to some degree, they are intertwined. There's no question that the Russian government has, I think, given the go-ahead to its completely freewheeling and independent cybercriminal gangs to attack the West with impunity. And this kind of political barrier protecting Russian ransomware gangs has proven to be an enormous and years-long problem for our cybersecurity. It may be one of the biggest that we face. I wrote another book about cryptocurrency tracing as a law enforcement investigative technique, and how that, it turned out that you can trace cryptocurrency with incredible fidelity and track down cybercriminals. And that has led to, incredible wins for U.S. investigators. But it doesn't help when those cybercriminals are in Russia beyond our reach. And in fact, protected, perhaps even encouraged by the Russian government to sow chaos across the West. From the shutdown of the Colonial Pipeline, which provided gas to the east coast of the US and led to gas shortages when that attack hit, to the attack on Change Healthcare, a part of United Healthcare that allows for the reimbursement through insurance of pharmacies and clinics and medical providers across the US. That attack disrupted hundreds and hundreds of those medical providers. One of the worst cyber attacks we've ever seen on the US healthcare system, even comparable to NotPetya. And this is all kind of being done by not the Russian government, but by Russian private gangs of criminals who have been essentially given the go-ahead by Putin.
You write in the book about various former White House officials and other people who are close to the decision-making capabilities in Washington who have suggested that really the U.S. wants to have the freedom to engage in its own cyber attacks. And what you describe in the book is kind of a country with a very hawkish offensive policy and yet extreme vulnerabilities for its own defense. Of course, I think that's something that has been echoed in really recent months by Timothy Hoff, who was the director of the NSA and the U.S. Cyber Command before he was fired in April. And I wonder if you agree with that assessment today.
I do think that still holds true on a kind of broad level, that the U.S. most of all wants to maintain the ability to carry out these same kinds of attacks itself, if it feels the need, if it wants to have the flexibility to carry out destructive cyber attacks, even on civilian critical infrastructure, if the case arose where it believed that would be helpful in a war scenario or otherwise. But I do think that in some ways the situation has improved. After the book came out in 2019, in 2020, the US finally called out Sandworm and, in fact, indicted 6 of the group's hackers a year after the book was published initially, and confirmed this theory that Sandworm was this one unit of Russia's GRU, military intelligence agency, a theory that I had published in the book in 2019, and in fact put a bounty on these hackers' heads. So, there is a renewed sense of accountability. I think that the Biden administration ramped that up even, called out Russian cyber attacks on Ukraine immediately as they began to happen in the run-up to the 2022 invasion. America's awareness and responsiveness to Ukraine's plight has completely changed, or it did, at least during the Biden administration. I think it's still an open question whether Trump will maintain that support for Ukraine. But we have certainly come a long way since the complete silence in response to Sandworm's attacks in 2015, 2016. And I think there's some hope now of kind of accountability for these reckless attacks on civilian critical infrastructure. I do think that what's still lacking, though, is a kind of formalized, kind of Geneva Convention for cyber war. That's the thing that would truly create a kind of arms control around what is otherwise this new dangerous force of chaos in the world.
Andy, I told you that I found the book stomach turning, and nothing made me quite as queasy as the line, your line, on the internet, we are all Ukraine.
Well, right. I mean, it was Michael Hayden, the former director of the NSA and CIA, who at Black Hat one year, the big hacker conference in Las Vegas, said on the internet, we're all Poland, because, Poland is like this extremely vulnerable country with, in World War II with enemies on all sides. And I think, but the same thing applied to Ukraine. You could say that about Ukraine too, that it was always this victim of its geography, that, it was vulnerable to the Tatars in the east and the Mongols and eventually the Soviets and then the Nazis and then Putin's Russia as well, to invasion on all sides. But in the midst of this cyber war, we learned that because we are all connected on the internet in a new way, because borders mean something different, in this world without borders, essentially, we are all on that front line. We are all Ukraine in that sense. And that is what I ended the book with in 2019. I think I didn't even really know to what degree that would resonate. I think now this idea that we are all Ukraine, it kind of carries this larger message that we in the West need to face the threat of Russia together.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your being here and appreciate the book, and I'm glad it's getting a second life in some form in some parts of the world.
Well, this has been a great conversation. Thank you, Morgan.
Thank you for tuning in for the debrief. More debriefs are available exclusively to SPYSCAPE Plus subscribers. You'll also be able to access other premium series, like The Razumov Files, our ambitious retelling of Joseph Conrad's Under Western Eyes. And for true crime fans, there's The Great James Bond Car Robbery, the story of the hunt for James Bond's most notorious set of wheels. Subscribers also get new episodes of True Spies early and ad-free. Subscribe to SPYSCAPE Plus at plus.spyscape.com. Disclaimer. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the subject. These stories are told from their perspective, and their authenticity should be assessed on a case-by-case basis. If you're enjoying this podcast,
Hey folks, get ready for a new season of Blowback coming Monday, September 22nd. This time around, we're covering the Cold War showdown in Africa.
When apartheid South Africa invades the newly independent nation of Angola, revolutionary Cuba sends its own army to defend its African ally, while the United States backs a warlord whose only goal is power.
Subscribe now at blowback.show and get the entire season when it drops, ad-free. Blowback.show.
Life's full of big money decisions. Dividend versus growth stocks, tapping home equity, even navigating tariffs.
And for every smart tip out there, there's another one that sounds smart but isn't.
That's where NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast comes in. I'm Sean Piles, a certified financial planner professional.
And I'm Elizabeth Ayola. On NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast, our finance journalists do the homework so you can make confident wealth-building moves.
Whether you're building your portfolio or protecting it, we've got the facts and a little fun along the way.
Follow NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast on your favorite podcast app.